I'm David Bank, and from Impact Alpha, this is an Agents of Impact podcast.
There's always a lens when there's decision making. The real question is, what is influencing the lens?
That's Rey Ramsey, CEO of the Nathan Cummings Foundation and author of the new book, The Tyranny of False Choices, A Guide to Authentic Decision Making. I've known Rey for decades, back to his launch of the digital equity nonprofit One Economy, and through his path in government, the private sector, and philanthropy. He's bringing his boundary-crossing perspective to how foundations invest, grant, and lead. I spoke with Rey about venture grants, transparency as a prerequisite for action, and how he has kept Nathan Cummings committed to racial, economic, and environmental justice, even as some institutions scrub their websites and trim their sails. The Nathan Cummings Foundation is a charter member of Impact LP, Impact Alpha's premium membership for limited partners, asset allocators, and other agents of impact. I think you'll enjoy our conversation. Rey Ramsey, welcome to the podcast.
Awesome to be here.
Rey, you and I have known each other, I think it's pushing 30-ish years now from your days back at One Economy. And so I've always looked to you for authentic decision-making. And I'm so delighted now you've written a book about authentic decision-making called The Tyranny of False Choices. So I want to give our readers a guide, your guide to authentic decision-making. But start us off on the other side, which is, what is a false choice, and what do you mean by that?
Well, there's so many ways to venture into this situation of sort of the dichotomous issues that happen in our lives, and it's something that everybody in the world encounters. And the question really is, can you spot it when it's happening? And what I look at and what I explore in the book, but in life, is really being able to examine and take a deep breath to look at data, to look at information, to understand what's going on, because a lot of information is coming your way, and very often it's loaded with an agenda. So I'll give you an example. I had a reporter, who I won't say whom, asked me about the new administration and some of the changes, and they said, how are you responding to everything that's going on? And I knew that there was a common answer the reporter wanted, and this is in the context of me being the CEO of Nathan Cummings Foundation. And I said, well, I'm going to use this alliteration with three R's. So I said, this is the three R's. And I said, because there are three groups. And I said, so one group, looking at the nation, only wants us to reduce when we look at spending. Reduce, reduce, reduce. Another group only wants to restore, restore, restore. And I said, I'm in the third group, which is reform. And I said, and the reform doesn't get the same attention. So very often, decisions that we make, some of the best things are left on the cutting room floor, that we never give ourselves a chance to make those authentic decisions, because we're having default decision making. It's, well, that's my tribe. This is what I believe. Very often people are surfing to have their existing beliefs reinforced, rather than opening their minds. And so my hypothesis, which I think is a very human occurrence, is we are bombarded with false choices more frequently than we realize.
Maybe there's a fourth R, reframe. It sounds like what you're doing is saying that there's actually a broader menu of opportunities than the narratives, the dominant narratives on any side sometimes allow for.
Well, I've always been fond of the term expand your aperture. And so if you think about it, David, we live in a world where there are forces that want us to make ever more narrow decisions. And I'm saying, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you expand your sight lines? Because you just might find something that was out of reach, out of sight.
Well, let's take a real example that I know you're very familiar with, and it's germane, I think, even to our history, because we've been tracking on the sort of tech revolution for all these decades, and I know you have been. And most recently, you've become outspoken, and in fact, even an investor in Anthropic, which is on everybody's lips these days. But the promise of AI, or maybe the way people think about AI, may represent another one of these false choices. There's the accelerationists, there's the doomers. How are you reframing it?
It's exactly as you're stating it. It's sort of the doom and gloom or the techno optimist, where all things are possible. When we know all the things come together, here's what we have to fundamentally make a set of decisions, right? So you think about AI, you say, what is destiny and where is choice? So there are certain things that are destined to happen. We know that it's transformative. We know that it does increase productivity. These are things we know. But what is left to us as a society are a set of choices. And so the question is, what will drive those choices? Will they be driven out of fear? Will they be driven out of tribalism, prejudices, other sorts of biases, which will lead you down the wrong path? And so when you look at other technologies, we have had a long habit globally, but particularly in America. Every time there is a breakthrough technology, we hype up the promise of what it's going to do. And I've tried to work in this space of supporting the potential of lower income people to move from the have nots into the haves. So if you look at history, people had aspirations for radio. They then had aspirations for television, right? And television was going to be transformative with education. Now you get these grainy public access channel stations with some weird person writing on a chalkboard. No one watches. So I'm like, good luck with that. So then it's like, oh, here comes the digital age, which is why I started One Economy back in the day with Ben Hecht. And we said there are some things we can do with broadband that would be transformative. But again, the promises of broadband were way out there about it was going to transform this and transform that. But here's where you look. What were the choices we made when we looked at broadband? We way over indexed for the issue of access, if you just had access. And so what did we count? We counted, oh, we're giving away computers. Oh, we've got a landline. Oh, we've got, this. But the real gems and the things that were out of the sight lines were, how could we use it to elevate people's lives? How could we use it for human flourishing? And it transcends, do you have access? And so we argued at the time with One Economy, and we got into fights with people about it. And I remember funny being labeled as he's the anti-library guy, because at the time Gates was launching a library initiative, and people said he's going to be the Carnegie of this century. And I go, okay, libraries, that's fine. And then you had the folks at AOL launching a program called Power Up, which were centers. And I said, those are good too. But we took the road less traveled, which was, and at the time, it was like seen as we were like doing heterodox thinking. Now you can't imagine that it wouldn't be the case, but we said it needs to be in the home, it needs
Mm-hmm.
to be in the home for every low income person. And I remember being on a panel very graphically, and everybody was like exalting these center based programs, and they were kind of smashing me a little bit, David. I was like the outlier. And then the moderator was like, well, we're going to wrap it up. And I went, whoa, 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 wait a minute, wait a minute. And I said, I got shortchanged here. Let me ask each of the panelists a question. It was very simple. Where do you use broadband for you,
Yeah.
for you or your children? Show of hands, home. All of them were using the home. My simple point was, why would you create an alternative universe for the poor?
Yeah, so take that forward now. I know, and I think listeners may remember that Nathan Cummings Foundation with Omidyar Network and with Ford Foundation several years ago got a small slice of Anthropic. As we reported at the time, it was partly an attempt to be able to just be in the conversation, maybe to be able to have phone calls returned. I would hasten to add that it's a tiny little a corner of that company, but I imagine it's done actually fairly well on your as you market to market in your portfolio. But in any event, just the engagement. What's the equivalent of your heterodox thinking from back then in the new AI discussion?
Well, that's got several dimensions to it. The first to address is why we wanted to get in. So more than the economics, it is about having a seat at the table. And David, you're aware that Nathan Cummings Foundation is one of few, because it's not as widespread as we would want, engages in shareholder activism, and we take positions in some companies so that we can show up and have proxy voting rights and other sorts of rights because we think you just need to get in the game, rather than sort of just flying on the outside and critiquing from outside the gates. And so sometimes you've got to go inside. So that was a primary driver of ours. But now when you look at AI, and again, a book, not my book, but the one that was the final book that Kissinger contributed to, and Eric Schmidt and Craig Mundy from Microsoft, I believe his name, if I get that right. But the book was called Genesis, and they do a wonderful job of looking at some of the determinants of where they view AI, going. And they ask this powerful question: what is going to influence whom? Will it be the AI influencing us more as humanity, or will it be the other way around? And again, I look at this and I say there are choices to be made. So I am not one, because you'll have some people, depending on their ideological leanings, are, well, everything should be shaped by government, and we don't like corporate competition or even nation state competition. I believe all those interests are fine. There's going to be nation state competition. There's going to be frontier models competing with each other. My only question is where we need to answer as a society is, where does public interest sit? And it doesn't have to dominate anything, but it needs to be addressed. And there are issues in the public interest. And of course, there are obvious ones like health and safety, of course, right? And putting certain guardrails, of course. But we're going to have real issues around who are the actual gatekeepers, and how does that work? If they're really pursuing the intentionalities that are made possible by the technology. So we already have seen the tremendous capacity for productivity. So to start a business, in the past, you might have needed 3 or 4 engineers. You could do it with one. So the barrier to entry. So if you think about what a lot of people rhetorically talk about, wealth gap. Well, the only thing you're going to be able to do with wealth gap is you're going to have to help people build assets. And there are only a few ways to build assets, and owning a business is one of them. And there are a few others. So why would we not, as a matter of choice, make that even easier for people to have happen? We know one of the gateway issues is education. How long must we stumble around? This is the classic false choice: spending a lot of money on education, making education only an issue of money. It is not merely an issue of money. And I don't need to recount some of the statistics when you look at some school districts that actually spend a lot and they get terrible results. Others, more resilient, spending less. Are we examining that? And then what about the role of AI and agentic AI in particular, and what that could do to move the needle in education? I just argue that it takes intentionality, and what we need is an actual grand ambition in the country to pursue those things. Meanwhile, while nation state competition and the frontiers company competing, because there's going to be some good that comes out of that competition and even greater innovation. I don't want to choke off the innovation, and that's what would be a false choice, that you have to stymie innovation to do something for people. And what we can't do, and this is one of the other powerful elements of AI, if we play this right and make the right choices, it can enhance our agency rather than replace our agency. Those are choices. That is not destiny.
It seems like authentic decision making would be even more salient and relevant, as people have these awesome tools at their disposal, but still need, as you said, the purpose, the compass, the agency of what they're actually using these tools for. I know Nathan Cummings, you mentioned one of the few that engages in shareholder advocacy, also one of the few that's committed itself to 100% alignment of its assets, and this is something that's one of these trends that's forever coming among foundations, never quite arriving, except for, as I said, in a handful of you folks. But what does that give you the opportunity to do, in a sense? I mean, now that you've got your not only your grants, but now your investments lined up as well, with, where you're trying to go.
What I would say is, when you make a commitment, to go 100% impact, the number one thing you need is intellectual humility. Because what it will unearth, rather than all the things and the grand announcements, it will unearth a lot of things that you don't know. And then it becomes this search for how do we do it better. So when we declared we were going 100% impact, which was the right decision, what it meant was we had a whole lot more work to do, because the basic thesis of our foundation is to use our tools, the totality of our tools, to pursue racial, economic, and environmental justice. So you can see, you can just say, I'm announcing that we're impact, but that doesn't mean anything unless you go on a thoughtful journey to pursue solutions in those areas. And you're going to keep learning, and you're going to keep meeting other people. I tell our team all the time that we're endeavoring to be good social impact investors. And in order to do that, you need to have healthy paranoia about who you don't know and what you don't know. And so that's what I mean in the classic Socratic sense of you look at it and say, I know that I know little, and I have to pursue it. And so take for example, and this is going to be a bigger deal all along. So for a while, it was easy to say, we're not going to be in defense. We don't want any of our endowment to do
Hmm.
that, right? So I've been positing to people, now tell me what that means when many of the companies we have invested in are also doing defense work. And a lot of people will gang up on Palantir, per se. They are by no means the only Silicon Valley or Austin firm that is doing work with the $1 trillion plus budget coming out of the Defense Department. So what does that mean if you're an impact investor as the world is changing? In Europe, redefining sustainable investing to include more defense. And then they kind of use things, well, that's sustainable. We want to sustain our countries because NATO needs to remember that's a stretch, rather than, so you have to be humble with that. You have to keep moving along. What you want to do is make sure you have clarity on where your floor is. What are the things you will absolutely stay away from? But people come up with all these frameworks. The framework that we look at is, of course, there are things you're going to avoid, but then there's this middle section, which is there are things that are acceptable, but they need mitigation. There are things that need to be mitigated in order to make that an acceptable investment. And you're going to run into these complexities with data centers, right? So if it's easy to say, well, I'm not going to invest in a data center. But then I would say to you, okay, so you have holdings in AI companies. Well, all AI companies need the data center. So what does that mean for you? So what I'm saying, David, is it opens up more questions. And what you have to do is go on a humble journey. So that's why you won't see from me or my foundation, I call it like the gauzy language of just sort of coming out and constantly patting yourself on the back. We are very happy that we made this commitment, but we know that we were signing up for a journey.
Absolutely, and another example of that is mining. We always point to. I mean, people decry the mining, but they like their iPhones, they like their electric vehicles.
I've
Um,
said this to so many people, David, over the time, and they would say, like, very proudly, and so what we've got to do is shed that skin of bragging and that skin of virtue signaling and just do the work. And so it catches you, and bites you if you go out there making these things. For a while, I've been saying that, and I've done a lot of sustainability work outside of the foundation. And I kept asking that with electric cars. And everybody like proudly, look at this. And I'm like, but wait a minute. Or humorously, other people, I won't mention names, I would say, well, wait now. Now, where do you think electricity, how does that get generated? And very often it's generated. And even if you have renewables, you have to have redundancy in the systems. So you still have to bring the fossil fuels for adequate redundancy because you have latency problems. So it's really important to know that there are complexities. What matters is your good faith movement. So if you have, what am I avoiding? What could be mitigated? What you're trying to unearth are the golden nuggets, which are there some solutions that we can invest in education and in health, that are curative, as we map the human immunological system, and we bring AI to that. Those are solution oriented. And I also would argue opportunities, on the investment side. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to migrate on this continuum. You're going from what I'm avoiding to what I can mitigate to where I can lean into to maximize opportunities for solutions. And then things will move and shift a little bit, and so you have to stay active, and you have to have a partner, either internally or externally, that's helping to guide you through that. And what's required is transparency. What do we
I
own?
was going to I was going to take you straight to transparency, but you actually diverted me here with the advisor and the partners. And I know that you and at Nathan Cummings have been on this point about the importance of the advisor, and at some level they become a gatekeeper at some institutions, telling the sometimes the decision makers, even the trustees, "Oh no, you can't do that. We have these hurdle rates. We have these expectations. It's very nice to think that way, but that's not realistic." You've gotten over that at Nathan Cummings. You also have, I think, changed your advisors.
Yes. And David, I'm smiling because you know enough of me that if you keep telling me that I can't do that, I actually want to do it more. And so always appropriately examine people in gatekeeper roles. And very early on, I started at the foundation, not as the CEO, but I was on the investment committee as a trustee. And you could see the contours of this, and how what language was being used, and words of can't, and this and that, rather than the words of possibilities. And again, being laid into a false choice. You do not have to have subpar returns because you're doing impact work. And there have been studies, but people want to hold on to that because it's easier to not have to work through those frameworks and lens. I get it. But what we have in Vivian West Fuller is a firm that sees the world in a similar way that we do, through the lens of opportunity. And like us, we're on a journey to keep moving our resources toward those solutions. We're seeking the mitigations that are required. So we brought them in with us, and there were many people who were like, "Oh, you're taking a risk. You're taking a risk," because again, the word risk is one of the gatekeeping terms that's used. And one of the big problems in the world is who gets to manage money. And when you just look up, and we don't do quotas in our foundation, but you have to say something doesn't feel right if you added up all the women and all the people of color who manage money and it's less than 2%. There's
Mm-hmm.
something a bit odd about that. So that wasn't what we were seeking when we made the change to Vivian West Fuller, but what an amazing thing. And to take a firm where they had many people closing doors on them, they had some successes. I mean, we didn't make them; they came together. But in their endowment business, when we selected them, they only had one other, which was smaller. So we far and away became the largest client. Today, I think they have like 28. And so I use the expression, the water is fine, you can get in. And they're doing a really good job. And sometimes, and if you think of your own life, I think of my own life, but there's a story in all of our lives where someone or some institution, I use this expression, says yes to you. Somebody's got to give you that first yes. If you're starting a business, starting your own enterprise, some of those people have to say yes. Well, everybody needs a yes. Everyone. And we too often withhold it. And I remember, we mentioned earlier with One Economy, Ben Hecht and I and a couple of others started it, and I was the president of Enterprise, which is a large CDFI intermediary, largest in the country. And my late father said to me when I told him I was leaving, and I'll never forget it. He was not a man of a lot of words. He shook his head and he said, "You had a good job." And I left to start this in a basement with 4 people because we believed in it. And then there were several people who said yes to us, 3 people in different parts of philanthropy, but it was tough because I had it was like 10x, 10 no's to every one yes.
I love that. Everybody needs a yes. I sometimes think from my study and reporting on foundations in particular, won't mention any, that they're all sort of programmed to say no. Everybody's coming at them for money. Kind of the default position is no until proven otherwise. I don't know whether you have any ways in this guide to authentic decision making of sort of getting to yes, or giving people that yes in
Well,
some
we
way.
really
How did
do.
you?
It's what we aspire to do. And so let me tell you one little thing that we put in place that early on everybody's like, what's this? What's this? Because again, I believe in like taking down the walls, and I talk about in the book boundary crossing. And so I believe in the importance of crossing boundaries, ideological boundaries, racial boundaries. You can't just stay in your own enclave. And so I had the benefit of working in government and the private sector, as well as now philanthropy and the NGO sector. And one of the things which has been successful, as you know, in the private sector is the venture capitalists. And so I introduced, both in name and in approach, venture grants. And so when I first said that, people were like, what? What? And I said, so what I want to do is empower you on our team. And I'm very proud of our team, and they've done a good job of it. And I started using the language of investing. And I said, we are social impact investors, even with our grants. Because some people, there's this notion like, well, let's just give it. And I said, no. And so what you want to do is you want to find those social entrepreneurs, and you want to treat it like venture. And so they have the ability to do as high as $100,000, which if you're starting a little basement operation like I did, that means the world to you. And that's overnight become a very popular thing. And that's where you can give the yeses. But there are other ways to do it. I still keep on my schedule a healthy dose of social entrepreneurs that just want that little bit of time. And they're always surprised the CEO of a foundation will make that time. And I go, because I've never forgotten what it was like to pursue the money myself. And so, do unto others, and that's a lot of our culture in our organization. So we spend a lot of time, even if I can't give you the dollar, it's how can I connect you to somebody else. But also, one of the most powerful ways of receiving the yes is somebody taking the time to listen to you and just hear you out, and then maybe make a few suggestions.
That I imagine you may get a few phone calls after this podcast for folks who want a little bit more of your time, Ray. So
Catherine, who handles my schedule, who's a wizard, always fits in, and it's really one of the most rewarding things. And I've had students, other people. I had one group, I won't say their name, with their business plan, and I said, "Do you really want me to look at this?" Because it had a kernel of something good, and I shredded it because it needed to be shredded. And if that individual's listening, he knows who he is. But they completely revamped it, and they've raised millions.
there you
And they took it, and I just love working with them because again, they're willing to listen, and they don't show up with certainty. And so that's what I meant early on when we started about, if you're going to take this journey, you have to have the intellectual humility that goes with that, which is you are a constant learner. When we did our strategic plan 4 years ago, the term that we introduced was is that we would embrace having, quote, an ethos of learning. And that is cascaded across our organization, an ethos of learning. And so we take that very seriously.
And part of that, and I know you've been emphasizing this, quite strongly, is transparency. And I know that has, that takes place at a lot of levels. But why is that so important? And how do you think about that?
If you lack transparency, it is an inhibitor to your learning. And so one of the things that the team was very open with, and I'm smiling now because I asked the question. I said, "All right, after you've made this grant, do you really look at this stuff? These like reports that you get." And most people, they were kind of like, not so much, like a little bit. It's kind of like filed away. So I took a page out of something that we're all familiar with from the private sector. You have a team that's called asset management, right? So when I first introduced this concept, I said, well, I want asset management for grants, not just because I said those are assets. And I asked the fundamental question: asset managers are people that are there to protect your investment and to look at data and learn from what's going on. So we have this amazing person, Janet, on our staff, who I appointed to be the head of asset management, who will look at our grants and our PRIs, our program related investments. And when we are making these investments, we have something called diligence and analysis. And part of it is there is a data collection portion, which is part of our covenant in giving those resources. And what we do respectfully to our partners that we are investing with is we ask them the question rather than us superimposing it. What data do you look at to measure or monitor your progress? So it's not
Well,
Nathan Cummings imposing it. And then I want to collect that. And then all we want to do is go back, not for purposes of evaluating them, it's for looking at ourselves. So let's say you did the same kind of a thing 10 times and you had similar results, which were lesser than what was anticipated. Shouldn't you learn from that a little bit? Yes. So that's why we're
indeed.
doing it, and it's transparent.
Indeed, indeed, and also on transparency, there's kind of being forthright about your purpose. I noticed earlier in our conversation you said Nathan Cummings exists to advance racial, economic, and social justice. Some, as straightforward as that seems, some folks have trimmed their sails and changed their language in these times, and you've put that out there very, very forthrightly. So, how do you see that kind of transparency playing out?
Well, part of it was, when people were, and this is what I'm saying, like sometimes you get caught up in this false choice and it'll make you do suboptimal things. I jokingly internally will say, my job is to make sure at a minimum we don't do stupid things. So the lawyer in me looked at, the landscape a year and a half ago or almost 2 years ago. And I said, what we have to make sure we comply with, and it's not a new invention, are the laws of 501c3 that are very clear.
Which are
Uh,
the nonprofit tax laws?
yes. And so that is not a new invention. And so if you were not doing things appropriate to that, you should look out. It has nothing to do with the occupant in the White House. And then you look at what, and again, I'm a lawyer, so I tend to look at it in a particular way. What does the Civil Rights Act require of us? And what can't be done? So I would use this analogy, and it was tough. And I said, look, if I'm running a race and I'm a black man, and there are three other white guys, excuse the example, and we're all in the race. What I don't want is, in the 100-meter dash, is a boulder at the 20-meter mark for myself. But then I would remind people, but you're not allowed to take that boulder or any other boulder and put it in the way of the white folks. So if you're doing those sorts of things, it's problematic. What we want to do is make sure that all of those runners have an opportunity to get to the finish line, all of the runners. And so we've taken that approach. And so you don't have to hide from the fact that, first of all, everybody belongs to a race. So if I'm saying racial justice, yes, I want racial justice for all races. And that's really important. And so we weren't going to change what we were saying because the Constitution gives you the right to believe. So I walked around saying I have the right to believe. Now, my behaviors have to comply with those critical laws, but I'm going to believe what I choose to believe, and I'm entitled to communicate beliefs. And so, what was getting litigated when people were getting nervous were behaviors. And I said, and they wouldn't want to get somebody on a speech case because they're going to lose it. And we would win it, and we would defend ourselves if we needed to. But our job is to comply with the law but proudly state our beliefs.
And I think one of the lessons of you and your foundation colleagues, who very forthrightly early on did state, the freedom to invest, freedom to give, freedom to work with the communities that, that all the foundations have been working with. It kind of forestalled some of the worst fears. You said people were nervous, but the shoe didn't quite drop, and I think folks attribute that a little bit to standing together and speaking in a strong voice.
I think that people were, there's the boogeyman effect. And so I kept saying, we're not going to spend energy on all that. Everybody's like, right. I'm not going to do all that. I'll be ready if we need to be ready, but let's continue to do the right thing. If we're doing proper diligence and analysis with our work, why would we have anything to be worried about? And I just trust the court system. Now, as they say, you can indict a ham sandwich. So that's the expression. So you can't get all worked up over that. Certain things out of your control. It's like, stoicism, control the things that you can control. And that tends to be the approach that I prefer to use. And so I don't want to expend a lot of energy on some of those kind of things, it might be decided that I don't control. But the parts that we can control, we can do a good job with, and we can comply with the law.
So maybe, Ray, just pull this back together and apply the sort of authentic decision-making rubric more broadly, not just to the foundation's investments, but sort of to where finance and you talk about systemic change. Is there a different way of thinking about investment in finance writ large for the economy as a whole?
Look, because my thesis of this is always that there's always a lens. There's always a lens when there's decision making. The real question is, what is influencing the lens? And for example, is it really your compass, or is it completely guided by your biases? And so when I give the example about, you know, too often if someone who looks like me, a black man that comes in, suddenly there is this notion of risk if I want you to invest in my company that is not there for somebody else. That is not being guided by wisdom or your compass. And so that means you're not making authentic decisions. They're inauthentic. And I write about this because I say, not only do you have these externalities that create distractions and distortions, but one of the elements of those distractions and distortions are what I call internal whispers. And I jokingly say, well, you go to bed with yourself every night. And so your own insecurities, your sense of trauma, your history, the things that might hold you back. So you might not even try because you're holding yourself back. And so you're impeding your own ability to make decisions. So the operative word, and what I say as an antidote to making these inauthentic and false choices, is liberation of thought. Liberate your thought from all the biases, the algorithms which are feeding you what you already believe. And so we have to put more energy in to say, I need to pursue data and information unobstructed, but know that there are people who are motivated by power, status, and money that will try to influence that. So we have to navigate through all of that to get to the best decisions possible.
Well, liberate your thought. I think that's a good note to end on, Ray. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and we're going to be checking back in and hope you can guide us all to some authentic decision making. Thanks for so much for joining us.
I will do my best. Thanks for having me, David.
That's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Big thanks to Ray, to our producer Isaac Silk, to the whole team at Impact Alpha, and to all of you Agents of Impact, with deep gratitude for all that you do.